The following is my book review for Trauma Doesn't Stop at the School Door. I would begin with the way that Karen Gross structures the book. So by beginning with naming, another way of saying it may be the way she begins with theory. So she is telling us what is trauma, sharing aspects of it, definitions, things that are accepted widely, and then those that should be but have not been, and also adding in scenarios and stories that help to make it feel more relatable and understandable for the reader. And she follows that up with the practical application of how to address trauma within our education system and really our world. And so she is able to provide within taming strategies and possible solutions to make trauma responsive schools education possible, and follows that with framing. So how is it situated within our current world and the current students that we teach? And one quote really spoke to me, and I feel like kind of got me thinking broadly about the way my experiences have fit into the book, the emotional reactions that I had because of it. And it was that trauma's ability to affect you on your own doorstep. And in the book, she talks about how when trauma is prevalent in your school, in your students, with your coworkers, the population, the community that you serve, you are more likely to be inclined to become more trauma responsive. And I have found that to be true working in a Title I school, in a city setting, an urban setting. I have found that I am facing and seeing trauma both with my students. So I'm having a secondary trauma response or compassion fatigue. I'm becoming exhausted. I'm having an inability to care for myself, and I'm finding that I'm not as good at my job because of the amount of trauma that I am taking on from my students. And it was enlightening to have words put to those feelings, to almost make me feel like it makes sense, that the way that I have felt, the experiences that I've had, being in a classroom with so many students who have experienced so much trauma. And in a lot of ways, the response that I feel like I should have reminded me a lot of the arc when we were talking about racism. So there needs to be the trauma lens, there needs to be collaboration, there needs to be a trauma response. So there needs to be, in the end, a commitment and action. And it needs to be that replication of values. And so when I began to think about the book and the way that I emotionally reacted to it, I began to think about some of the things in the book that I was doing in my own classroom. And a lot of it goes back to the philosophy I have around managing behavior, but also just supporting students. And I don't know that I ever would have thought about it with this trauma lens without this book. So I thought about how I've said things like, I understand why you're fighting, or no emotion is bad, or what's happened, why, is this going on? An interesting point that was brought up in the book, why is the student going to the nurse? And I've thought that before, and I thought, maybe it is because at home, this student parents were going through a divorce. Was that something that was affecting them, not only mentally, but also physically? And so that mind-body connection that's referenced. Tried to use ACEs to inform my relationship with students alongside my school counselor. So many passions that I have within the field of education when I think about being a part of our STEAM committee and our push for STEAM in our school, being a advocate for positive behavior reinforcements in our school and community, really pushing for sensory experiences. I actually organized our farmer to help us to introduce our students to a garden in our school area. And I didn't realize until I was reading this book that all of those things had this connection to the way that I'm serving students with trauma. And it was powerful to think about it that way, and powerful to know that there is this connection with all these ways that I can serve my students, but without acknowledging that it is based in trauma, that there is trauma. These strategies and resources aren't as powerful if they're not combined together, and obviously if they're not used by more than just me or my team. It has to be bigger than that. And so as I think beyond, and I think about the key findings in the research and the insights that the book shared, some of the things that were very striking to me were things like the way that cortisol disrupts neurodevelopment as well as the immune system. And so just the physical way that students can be affected by trauma, and also the way that trauma can get confused with ADHD. And so that a student who I may have mistaken for showing symptoms of ADHD may have actually had trauma that I was unaware of or did not address. And so that insight, I think, is super, super powerful and important for educators to know. I think at the same time, thinking about the impact of transitions within the education system and how those transitions can be so difficult for students who have not had consistency within their lives, whether that is at home or at school, and how it can be harmful for them to experience those transitions. I mean, from the way the book talked about, going from home to school to home, like that's a transition, but also there's the ones that happen in a classroom, especially an elementary school classroom, where you're having to go from learning something to maybe going to the bathroom to getting your lunches. There are so many steps and so many transitions, and so often we get so frustrated with students during those transitions, but we're not thinking about the impact that they're having, or the way that a student is reacting could be due to the fact that they have trauma, and that those changes, especially quickly, can be very traumatic for them. I think it's also important to discuss the triphasic symptomology, and how when the education system sees success, they might mistake happiness as the symptom of trauma. And so these students who are overcompensating or hyperacting, I guess, really could be exhibiting symptoms of trauma, but so often we're overlooking them because they're doing what they're supposed to do, or they're exhibiting excitement or any other things. But what we could be missing is that they have experienced something and they're needing to be the dandelion in their life. And so without kind of digging into that, we're not sure, we don't know. Lastly, I think the importance of language within the research that is discussed. So the way that trauma responsive is so specific to the fact that there has to be action. So without responding to all of this information, all of these things that we know, there cannot be actual change. There cannot be actual progress or movement forward. And so that kind of transitions into this awareness to action. So what do we do? And the way that Karen presented macro and micro ideas on how to implement changes. And one that really stuck out to me was the positive childhood experiences, and something that I think was done very well within my school. There were several things in place that at the end of the day, the goal was for these kids to come in, know that they were loved, know that they were welcome, and think about each and every day as something that was a positive memory for them to look back on. And so much of that kind of came from this top down from my principal. And so then looking beyond that, with the macro and the micro, I can think of specific things within my own districts that have been happening at the macro level, where the superintendent has made sure that there is new money and funding coming in for more school counselors and more trauma responsive trainings, and additional coaches, calm coaches is what we've kind of called them, that are available as safe spaces for students. And then on that micro level, kind of getting into the things that we as teachers and we as schools are doing by collaborating and training. But I think as a whole, it's not being necessarily called trauma responsive. So it's, the idea being mental health. But I think there needs to be that acknowledgement that trauma is very much a part of the end goal, serving those students with trauma, making sure that those students have empowerment and choice and autonomy, and that there's an open door for families. The healing cannot happen without them. The community cannot happen without them. And so I think, moving on even from that, just the small things of how to laugh and find joy and have fun for these students, and giving them our authentic human selves so that they can give us theirs. But at the same time, we have to lead that. So this is not the student's job. It is the educator's job to do these things, to put these things in place, to be these spaces for these students, to be the listeners. So I thought that was very powerful in the last part of the book, that listening is such an important part of what really could be the central space in a school, and how does that become incorporated alongside all of the 5 S's and the 6 T's. And lastly, just to touch on Generation T. So I think it was very powerful to say that Generation T, they all share trauma, but they experience it so differently. So at the end of the day, our responses to trauma have to be varied, they have to be personal, they have to be unique. They have to take into account that each of the students who's coming to us is coming to us with a different experience, a different culture, different identities. And in order to serve them best, we have to be able to tailor our response to their personal identities and the things that they need. Thank you.